welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be making the adorable Heart Apron from Animal Crossing New Horizons. This is one of my favorite items. Also had this fabric in my stash for a while. I only have footage of the fabric for you at this point because I've already made this. My fabric was from Minerva.com. It is the 1/8 inch check gingham. It's like a yarn dyed gingham in red. I will obviously leave it linked below so you can find it super easily. Also consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't done that already. It would mean so much to me, and maybe leave it a like on this video if you like this video, and let me know what you thought about it. Enjoy the video. Bye. Okay, so I've gone ahead and drawn out a template, an idea of what I want to do, and this is using the design from the game. So I drew it in pencil, but I actually am just going to go over it in pen to show you. So it's important when you're recreating something to break down kind of the components of the piece. So we have the waistband of the apron, then we have the kind of skirt is what I'm going to call it, which is sort of like gathered a little bit, and that has a ruffle at the bottom. It also has some pockets which are in the same fabric as the skirt, but then it has a little like what I'm assuming is like rickrack around the pocket. Then at the top you have the actual, heart-shaped bodice, or like pinafore part of the bodice, I guess, and that has rickrack on the inside, or like again, it's probably, I don't know if the game designers were thinking about what materials they were using, but yeah, I'm using rickrack for that. And then it also has a ruffle on the outside. Then obviously we have some straps, and the straps also have ruffles on them. But when you actually look at the back, and I actually designed the back as well, and which is kind of important as well, the straps only have ruffles to about where the straps meet, because they're crossed at the back, and you also have enough of the like strap of the waistband to form a bow, and the skirt of the apron actually has a sort of rounded shape. It's not squared off, and the ruffles go all the way to the top. So that's kind of important to have these things like jotted down, these ideas. So I wrote down kind of what I'm doing with them, and then I'm actually going to break it down into components as like pieces of patterns, or what they would be, pattern pieces. And this is the part where we like our pattern drafting, I guess. And so important things. First, we're going to be drawing out a big rectangle, and this is for our like skirt piece. And for that, I'm really just, I'm going to measure how long I want it to be. So like the height, or like, yeah, height of the skirt. So from my waist to where I want it to hit, which is around about the knee, I'm going to take that measurement, and that's how big I want the piece, or how tall I want the piece to be. And then for the width of the piece of this rectangle, I'm really just going to use the whole width of the fabric, because I want to gather it, and it's just easier than having to like, yeah, it just wastes less fabric. So yeah, so the height of this, just for reference, for me is 54 centimeters, but it might be different for you, obviously, because you are a different person to me. For the pocket, I actually used another piece of paper to like figure out, or actually the other side of this piece of paper, to figure out how big I want the pocket to be, because it's important to me that my phone fits in my pocket. So the way I did this was I drew around the phone. Hello, Olga, thank you. Okay, so I drew around my phone, and then I measured how like tall, like how tall my phone, like the width of it is. So like it's easier to explain here. Like I measured like the side height of it, which is about 1 centimeter actually, which is kind of surprised me. And this is with a phone case in, because obviously my phone's going to be in a phone case most of the time, so that's important. So I'm just adding 1 centimeter around all of the perimeter of the design of my phone. And then I think I added another 1.5 centimeters on top of that, which is like just a seam allowance. And I'm not probably going to stitch this with a seam allowance, but I'm probably going to I am going to stitch with a seam allowance, obviously, but I am going to use a smaller seam allowance probably. But I just like to have a little bit of extra room so my hands fit in there and I can put things in it. So at the end of all of this, the pocket turned out to be 14.5 centimeters by 22 centimeters. And we're going to be cutting out 2 of these. Again, I'm also going to be cutting, I didn't mention this, but I'm going to be cutting out 1 of the skirt. You could cut out 2 and make it like kind of lined. I think that would add a little bit more like floofiness to it, I guess. But I didn't do that because it turns out I didn't have enough fabric. I kind of struggled a little bit with fabric, as you'll see in a minute. The next piece we want to do is our waistband, and my idea was to use the width of the fabric again, because even that was going to be bigger than my waist, but I was going to use the rest of the ties to, turn into a bow, which is what happened. The thing is, I wanted to cut out 2 of them and make them each 10 centimeters high, but turns out I didn't have enough fabric to do that. So what I ended up doing was just cutting 1 at 8 centimeters high and folding it over. And I mean, I wish it was a little bit thicker, and the thing I wish I had done now looking back was to add interfacing to it, or to the portion that goes around the waist, but I did not do that, so it doesn't matter. It's fine, it's an apron, but it looks, I think it would have looked better. Anyway, next we then need our ruffle, and like the ruffle, we need tons of it, but I think it's an important idea. It's important to have the amount, like how big you want it to be, or how like wide, I guess, you want it to be. So I ended up actually making about 10.5 meters of ruffle, so just for reference. And I think I have like maybe less than half a meter left, so that's how much I used. For the ruffle, obviously we're just going to do the 1 layer, and I originally wanted it to be 11 centimeters high. That is not how big I made it in the end. I think in the end I made it 3.5 centimeters, which actually is way better, and I'm really happy that I did dwindle down, because the result is a lot more reasonable, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Also, I do apologize if there's like a bit more noise than usual, but I am recording in not my usual spot, and there's like a holiday this week, so a lot of kids playing a lot more than usual, so playing outside and making noise and stuff. So I do apologize for that if you can hear it, but you might not be able to unless you have like headphones on. Anyway, for the heart, I'm measuring kind of my chest area and how big I want it to be. I did end up making it a little bit bigger than I would like. Like, I think it looks fine in relation to the original, but I think if I was making this just off at the top of my head and I wasn't, trying to emulate a character or design or something, I would have made it a bit smaller. I'm going to show you how I designed the heart shape. But anyway, the idea was to grab a piece of paper that was 40 by 30 centimeters and then fold that in half and turn that into a heart. So that's what I did. That turned out fine. I was originally going to cut 2 layers of that, but I only ended up doing 1 layer. But I think too, if you have if you're not like tight for fabric as I was, then I definitely would recommend you do 2 layers just for sturdiness, and hiding all of the, raw edges and stuff just makes that a bit easier. And then for the straps, I measured how big I wanted them to be. I ended up making them smaller, but I did 2 straps that were 3.5 centimeters by 91 originally. And I don't know how much I cut off, but I cut off like probably 10 centimeters. So, but it's nice. I think with straps, it's nice to have a little bit more than them being too small. So that's definitely, I'm happy with them. Then I got some paper out, and you can use whatever paper you have on hand. You can use like regular printer paper, like taped together. You can use wrapping paper. You can use like proper pattern drafting paper, whatever you have. I have this like craft paper that I use for bigger pattern pieces, and it's like the end of the roll, so I kind of just want to like use it so I can buy more. I mean, I could buy more without using this, but I cut out a rectangle that was 40 by 30. I fold that exactly in half. And then I'm going to basically just like eyeball it and draw a heart out of this. I wanted to take up the majority of the space of the paper. I said I draw a heart, I mean half of the heart, obviously, because the reason you're folding the paper in half is so that your heart is perfectly symmetrical. And then for the pocket, I'm just going to be drawing out a rectangle that is 14.5 by 22, which is the measurement that I mentioned earlier. Then it's just a matter of cutting the fabric. I started by cutting off the skirt, and yeah, I tried to tear it, but it's two layers of fabric, so it wouldn't. Anyway, so I actually used the grid of the gingham to snip through, as a grid almost. Then at the edge, I kind of drew a rounded shape and cut that off so that I would have those nice rounded edges, as I mentioned earlier when we were designing. And then I used the remaining of the fabric to cut out my shapes. I entertained doing a double layer for the heart, but then turns out that wouldn't be possible. So I actually folded my pattern back in half and cut it on the fold. Then I cut out my pockets, and the rest of the fabric I kind of measured and used those measurements to decide, math out how much I needed for the ruffles, for the straps, and for the waistband. So I kind of had to, this is at the point where I decided to, why are they honking? Anyway, this is at the point where I decided that I wouldn't have enough fabric to make the straps and the waistband and even the ruffle as wide as I wanted them to be, or as tall, I guess. So that's when I decided to not do that. And yeah, I ended up cutting out the waistband first and the straps, and then everything else I had left over of fabric, I cut into equal size strips or equal width strips to then stitch together and to form a very long strip of fabric to then form into the ruffle, kind of like I would for bias binding. So yeah, I ended up with this lovely pile of fabric strips, and then I started pinning them together at the edges just to form a long strip, and so I could stitch it together. I didn't measure, I only measured this later on when I was already serging it and stuff, because I was wondering whether or not I could guess how big it was, and I couldn't, so just in case you were wondering about that. But yeah, it ended up being around 10.5 meters, which was a little bit too much, but I'm still quite happy that I did make all of that, because I like having too much ruffle. I like having too much trim, because you don't know if something's going to go wrong. It's just better to work that way, in my opinion. Because I didn't have enough fabric to cut 2 layers of the heart out, I decided to cut out some interfacing to give it a little bit more structure, because I'm obviously going to be adding ruffle and rickrack to this, and then straps, and it needs to be something that kind of sits upright on its own a little bit. That's that's a oversimplification, but it needs more structure than what this lovely gingham fabric has. So I cut out some interfacing and fused it, and then I moved on to prep the ruffle. This basically consisted of stitching those seams together, so I would form one continuous long strip of fabric. I'm just batch sewing that, so I would, take up less thread and whatnot. And I'm using as smallest seam allowance as I possibly can get away with, while remembering that I am going to be serging the edges, so I do need to leave a little bit of room for that. But you know me and my batch sewing, so I'm also going to be stitching together the rickrack onto the heart. And I'm doing this first before I add the ruffle, so that I can have more control over the placement of the rickrack and the ruffle without having to worry about things moving and all that. So yeah, I'm just stitching it straight off from the roll. I'm only going to cut it at the very end when I'm done. And again, stitching that really close to the edge. And my idea is that only half of the rickrack shows, so it looks like a scalloped edge. And when I get to this point of the heart where it forms a little V, what I do is I sort of twist the rickrack so it folds on itself and forms a smaller seam, or a smaller point, I guess. And when I get to the other edge of the heart, so like the other point, I snip off the threads and the rickrack. Then I'm moving on to my serger, and I am going to be serging the edges of the ruffle that I just stitched together, so the short edges. And then I'm also going to be, trimming them, cutting them, so that I can serge one of the long raw edges. I also did one of the sides, I don't know why, but yeah, we're gonna then do one of the sides of the long edges, and this is the side that isn't going to get stitched onto any seams, so like the hem of the ruffle, I guess. And this I want to have serged already, and I'm going to finish this hem before I do anything else, so that then when I want to work on the ruffle or apply the ruffle to anything, I already have it ready to go. I just have to stitch it and then finish the seam as I'm stitching the other seam. So like when I attach it to the skirt, I'm going to finish that raw edge anyway, and I don't have to worry about this raw edge. So to finish the hem of the ruffle, I folded that edge that I just stitched on the serger, and yeah, I just used the amount of like serged thread, I guess. If you've ever used a serger, you know what I mean. I used that as like a guide so that it was even all throughout the ruffle. And yeah, I just folded it over and top stitched it down, and did that for 10.5 meters. Now for the fun part. If you don't like gathering ruffles, this project is not for you. For the heart, I measured how, like the perimeter of it, I don't know if that's the right word, but like the edge around. And then I doubled that measurement and I cut that out of my ruffle. And then that's kind of my go-to sort of formula for the rest, for all of the ruffles. Then I do a basting stitch onto that ruffle, and I didn't do this earlier because you'd be cutting through the basting stitch when you cut through the ruffle, and you need a little bit of space at the edges where you don't have basting stitches so that you can actually like fold that back and have like a nice finished seam. And also for things like the skirt, I'm gonna show you a little trick where you're not gonna be doing the same basting stitch for the whole thing because it's so long and it's like one continuous piece of ruffle, and it just be really, really annoying to use. The thread might snap. I pull on the threads, I tie them off on one side and then I pull on the other, and until I kind of have something that measures the perimeter of the heart, and then I know that I'm sort of ready to start pinning it onto the heart. So now it's just a matter of pinning that on while moving the gathers so that they're like sort of evenly spaced, and then we're just going to stitch that in place. Then I serged the raw edge. It's a little bit hard to do around the V of the heart. What you need to do is kind of hold it so that it forms like a straight line, and that will go through your serger better. And then I pressed the seams so that my ruffle was facing out and the seam allowance was going towards the heart. And then I top stitched that in place because I wasn't going to line this and I wasn't going to, add any more fabric or anything. And I really wanted that, one, for the ruffle to stay in place, and two, for the seam allowance to also stay in place. So I did add that top stitch there. Then a lot of this is going to be repetition. So for the skirt, I again measured the like around the hem all the way to the top. So everything except what is going on the waistband. Here's the trick I wanted to tell you about. For the ruffle, for the skirt, I'm going to fold it in half and put a safety pin there. And then I'm going to fold it in half again and put safety pins at those points as well. And I'm only going to be putting gathering stitches between the safety pins. And I'm also going to be marking the skirt at those same points. So half and then half of that. It'll be a lot easier to gather between those points. So I know that between each safety pin of the ruffle needs to go between each safety pin of the skirt. So now the process is the same. You're going to space out the gathers like you would like we did for the heart. And we're just going to place them in between the safety pins. But yeah, once we've pinned that in place, stitch, then I'm going to again serge those raw edges, press, and top stitch. For the waistband, I folded it in half, the piece that I cut of the full length of the fabric, and I stitched it down, stitched it closed. I actually think I should have stitched it to the skirt and then, closed it, but I did it this way. Then I used a safety pin to turn it inside out, and I pressed it and closed the short edges and top stitched not only the short edges closed, but also just all around the waistband to kind of give me that same look that I have going on with the ruffles and stuff. Then I realized that I probably should have stitched the waistband to the skirt and then, finish that edge. So I did go ahead and serge the edge of the skirt. And yeah, after all of that top stitching, I didn't feel like unpicking it all and going back, so I just improvised. And then I also serged the raw edges of the pocket all around so that I could then stitch them onto my skirt later. Next, I added 2 rows of gathering stitches to the skirt so I could, gather it onto the waistband. Then I marked the waistband, so the points where I want the skirt to end and where the center of that is, basically, so I could match the center of the skirt to the center of the waistband and then gather it down into the size. And the way I figured out that spacing, or the place where I wanted the gathering to end, the skirt to end, was just by tying the waistband around my waist and kind of measuring that. I pulled it in, or gathered it, exactly how I've done for everything else so far, and pinned that in place, and then I went ahead and stitched it to the waistband. And of course, I gave that a good press at the end. Then I tried on my apron, or what I have of an apron so far, and figured out where I wanted the heart to be placed. Once I have the placement down, I went ahead and stitched that down by hand. It's a very small seam, and I didn't want it to be like top stitched, or I didn't want the seam to be visible on the waistband or on top of the heart, actually. So I stitched it in by hand on the underside, or like the wrong side, and then I also tacked it down on the right side just to make sure that nothing shifted. And once that was done, I pinned it to the dress form so I could figure out where I wanted the straps to go. You don't really need a dress form for this. Obviously, you could do it by yourself or ask somebody to help you. And the back straps obviously are going to be crisscrossing, so don't forget to take that into consideration when you're designing the straps. And then I did try that on myself just to double check and add the pocket placement. After transferring those markings onto the fabric, I measured how much ruffle I would need, so like the space of where I was going to apply the ruffle, and doubled it like I've done so far. And I also folded back the raw edges of the straps, so the short raw edges, so that they would be like kind of ready to be tucked into my serger and things like that once I got to that point. And then, we rinse and repeat. Tie off the ends of the gathering threads after, gathering the ruffle, gather it to the size I need, pin it, stitch it, run it through the serger, and when I run it through the serger, I also do the whole length of the strap just to keep it all in one go. And then I pressed it to the inside, top stitched it down, and again, when I'm top stitching, I'm also going to be folding in the serged edge of the strap that isn't ruffled and top stitching that down. And then repeating for the other side and for the other strap. For the pockets, I then folded down one of the shorter edges and top stitched that down on both of my pockets, and that's kind of to form the opening part of the pocket. Then I gave that a good press and also pressed in the edges, the serged edges of the rest of the pocket. Then I'm going to pin the pocket to the marked location that I marked earlier. And just, I like to put a pin in the opening edge first and then pin everything around and then remove that pin. And then I'm just going to top stitch that down in place, making sure to really backstitch really nicely at the opening edges. And then I gave that a nice press and started attaching the straps to the correct locations I had marked. And I am just going to stitch those down by hand again. And Again, I'm gonna go all around the edge on the inside on both straps at the top. But then for the bottom part where it actually matches the waistband, I'm going to do snaps so that it's way easier to take off and put on. And then I'm going to realize that I forgot about adding the rickrack around the pocket. So I'm going to grab some rickrack and place it around the pocket and then just stitch that down. I kind of wish that I had remembered this earlier so I could have like tucked it in the pocket seam properly. But this is fine. It's okay. Actually, in the design, this bit actually looks a lot more like proper rickrack than the little scalloped edge in the heart. Once I had finished adding the rickrack, finally, we were ready for the reveal.